The fall of the Aztec Empire, when gods walked among men. What if I told you that one of history's mightiest empires fell not to superior weaponry, not to overwhelming numbers, but to a lie so perfectly crafted that it convinced a god emperor to welcome his own destroyers with open arms? The year was 1519, and Moctezuma II, ruler of an empire stretching across modern Mexico, sat upon his throne in Tenochtitlan, a floating city more magnificent than anything Europe had ever conceived. With over 200,000 inhabitants, it dwarfed London and Paris combined. Its temples pierced the sky, its canals bustled with commerce, and its markets offered goods from across Mesoamerica. Yet within 2 years, this jewel of civilization would lie in ruins, its people subjugated, and its emperor dead. The fall of the Aztec Empire remains one of history's most shocking reversals of fortune, a tale where prophecy, betrayal, and cultural misunderstanding converged in a perfect storm of destruction. The Serpent's Return. When Hernán Cortés landed on the shores of Mexico with merely 500 conquistadors, he should have been nothing more than a curious footnote in Aztec history. The empire commanded millions of subjects, possessed vast wealth, and fielded armies that had conquered much of Mesoamerica. Yet Cortés arrived at a moment when the stars themselves seemed aligned for catastrophe. Aztec prophecy spoke of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god, who had once ruled the earth before departing eastward across the sea, promising to return in the year Seacatl, 1519 in the European calendar. When reports reached Moctezuma of pale-skinned, bearded strangers arriving from the east on floating temples, accompanied by thunder and lightning, the emperor faced an impossible question. Were these the prophesied gods returning home? The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Moctezuma, a leader who had expanded the empire to its greatest extent, who commanded absolute obedience from millions, found himself paralyzed by cosmic uncertainty. Spanish chroniclers noted his reluctance to act decisively, a hesitation that would prove fatal. Instead of mobilizing his vast armies, Moctezuma sent gold-laden embassies to the strangers, inadvertently revealing the empire's wealth while signaling what the Spanish interpreted as weakness. But prophecy alone did not doom the Aztecs. Cortés possessed something far more valuable than superior technology. He had intelligence, cunning, and an intuitive grasp of indigenous politics that would make Machiavelli proud. The web of betrayal. Here's where our story takes its most treacherous turn. Because empires rarely fall from external pressure alone. They collapse when their own foundations crumble from within. The Aztec Empire, for all its grandeur, was built on a system of tributary relationships that bred resentment among conquered peoples. The Tlaxcalans, fierce warriors who had never been fully subjugated, harbored particular hatred for Aztec rule. The Totonacs chafed under the burden of tribute payments. Dozens of city-states across the empire maintained their autonomy only through constant appeasement of Tenochtitlan's demands. Cortés, with remarkable strategic insight, recognized this weakness before he even reached the capital. Rather than attempting to conquer Mexico with his tiny force, he positioned himself as a liberator, a foreign ally who could free these peoples from Aztec oppression. The irony is breathtaking. Indigenous warriors, seeking freedom from one empire, helped establish the foundations for another that would prove far more brutal. The most crucial alliance came with the Tlaxcalans. After fierce initial battles that demonstrated Spanish military capabilities, Cortés negotiated a partnership that provided him with thousands of indigenous warriors. These weren't mere auxiliaries. They were experienced fighters who understood local geography, possessed knowledge of Aztec military tactics, and had generations of grievances to settle. Moctezuma personally welcomed the Spanish into the heart of his empire, housing them in the palace of his father. It was perhaps history's most catastrophic display of hospitality. The Spanish marveled at what they found. Bernal Díaz del Castillo, a conquistador who left detailed accounts, described Tenochtitlan as more beautiful than any European city. The great temple complex, the floating gardens, the bustling markets filled with goods unknown to European eyes. It was a civilization at its apex, confident in its power and secure in its traditions. Yet this confidence became vulnerability. The Aztecs' rigid social hierarchy, their religious worldview, and their political systems had evolved over centuries of regional dominance. They were unprepared for enemies who fought without honor, who broke sacred traditions, and who showed no respect for established protocols. Within months, Cortés had taken Moctezuma hostage while remaining a guest in the capital. The psychological impact on the Aztec population was devastating. Their god-emperor, the link between earthly and divine power, had become a prisoner in his own palace. When Moctezuma attempted to calm his people during Spanish attempts to suppress religious ceremonies, he was struck by stones thrown by his own subjects, a moment that shattered the foundations of Aztec political order. The final catastrophe. The end came not through a single decisive battle, but through a grinding siege that lasted months. After being driven from Tenochtitlan during La Noche Triste in June 1520, where hundreds of Spanish died and their indigenous allies suffered massive casualties, Cortés regrouped with devastating effectiveness. But here's the detail that changes everything. The Spanish didn't reconquer Mexico alone. They returned with an army of over 100,000 indigenous allies. The siege of Tenochtitlan in 1521 was not primarily a Spanish victory. It was a civil war in which indigenous peoples fought on both sides, with the Spanish serving as catalysts and coordinators. Cortés had constructed brigantines to control the lake system surrounding the island capital, cutting off food supplies and escape routes. More devastatingly, smallpox had arrived in Mexico, killing vast numbers of indigenous people who lacked immunity to European diseases. The final assault saw Tlaxcalan warriors fighting alongside Spanish soldiers against Aztec defenders who had been weakened by disease, starvation, and the defection of tributary states. When Cuauhtémoc, the last Aztec emperor, was captured in August 1521, he represented not just the fall of a dynasty, but the collapse of an entire civilization's political structure. The terrible irony. What makes the fall of the Aztec Empire so compelling and so tragic is that it represents a perfect storm of cultural misunderstanding, political miscalculation, and historical contingency. The empire that had dominated Mesoamerica for centuries fell not because it was weak, but because its strengths became vulnerabilities when confronted with utterly alien enemies. The Aztecs' sophisticated religious worldview, which had guided their rise to power, became a trap when faced with Spanish pragmatism. Their tributary empire, which had brought them wealth and dominance, provided their enemies with ready-made allies. Their confidence in their military superiority blinded them to new forms of warfare that combined European technology with indigenous knowledge. Most haunting of all is the realization that with different choices, had Moctezuma acted decisively when Cortés first landed, had the tributary states remained loyal, had the Spanish been treated as invaders rather than possible gods, the encounter between civilizations might have unfolded very differently. Instead, we are left with one of history's most dramatic reversals, an empire of millions brought low by hundreds of foreigners who succeeded not through strength, but by exploiting the very bonds that held their enemy's world together. The fall of the Aztec Empire reminds us that in the grand theater of history, the most powerful actors are not always those with the largest armies, but those who best understand the stage on which they perform. In the end, Tenochtitlan burned not because the Spanish were stronger, but because they were strangers who turned the familiar world upside down, and in that chaos, an empire lost its way home.